Chapter 2. In Mecca. I was now settled in Mecca, living the ordinary everyday life of a pilgrim waiting for the great pilgrimage. My ablutions were performed with the water of the well Zem, Hagar's well in the wilderness, as tradition has it, and for appearance sake I drank not a little of it, disagreeable as it was, being a mineral spring tasting like a weak solution of Epsom salts, and having a similar medicinal action. For each prayer said in Mecca, I was supposed to get credit for 1,000 said elsewhere. Still it is not desirable for any but the very devout to reside wholly in Mecca, as one's sins are multiplied in like proportion. I was not supposed to have any intercourse with my harem, if I had had one, nor to indulge in any feasting, sports, or amusements other than those allowable on religious grounds. Fighting and the shedding of blood were especially to be abstained from, and killing of vermin, flies, worms, etc. were almost equally reprehensible, on account of the probability of offending a jinn, a class of spirit which is believed to take this form and to be especially abundant in Mecca, and on account of the sanctity of all living things Meccan, whether jinns, men, or insects. I have heard a hot discussion as to the advisability of killing a human parasite, the slaughterer defending himself on the plea that the insect was undoubtedly of foreign extraction and but recently imported. My food consisted of the native diet of India, 2 meals of curry and rice a day, morning and evening, supplemented by such sweets, fruit, or tea as might be going in the household, for the rice I ate, no matter how much, never satisfied my cravings, it having, as far as my experience goes, much the same effect on a hungry man as salt water on a thirsty one. I sometimes went out into the streets and purchased bread from the Turkish soldiers, who sell their rations, and judging from the quality of their bread and the quantity they have to dispose of, they must be in clover here. After a week or 10 days I found I could walk about the crowded bazaars without attracting notice, my fair complexion exciting no curiosity among the checkered masses, nor my ignorance of Arabic giving me any inconvenience where so many nationalities were gathered, speaking more languages than I will stay to enumerate here, only mentioning that you may jostle against a Tartar, Malay, Negro, and Turk round any Hindi tea stall. Nor does the style of your get-up make any difference, except that it is advisable not to be too swell in order to avoid attracting beggars, but otherwise the Archbishop of Canterbury doing the tawaf in his mitre and robes would not occasion a passing remark, and would be placed nowhere by 20 much more wondrously attired figures. There was always something about that procession round the Kaaba that made me think of it as Madame Tussaud's male waxworks out for a walk, the many varieties of costume, the stolid expressionless faces and the peculiar Tussaud complexion, were all there. I suffered at this time from small boils on the hands, feet, or face, accompanied by feverishness, a complaint apparently peculiar to Mecca, which foreigners are seldom known to escape during the first month of their residence there. For a few days I was laid up with a very sharp touch of fever, lost count of time, nor did I attempt to recover any dates until my return to Jeddah. About this time, the end of the Ramazan fast came, and the great feast lasting for 3 days brought out the whole population, decked in their gaudiest apparel, while the guns from each of the 3 Turkish forts fired a salute of 21 at the times of the sunrise, noon, and sunset calls to prayers on each of the 3 days. The worship round the Kaaba in the great square was attended by larger numbers than I saw at any other time, notwithstanding that but few of the pilgrims had as yet arrived. I estimated that there could not have been less than 30,000 assembled at the sunset prayer on the second day. It was an imposing spectacle to see those thousands of bearded, turbaned, hard, worldly men standing, circle widening upon circle, round their sacred Kaaba, silently following the Imam as he praised God and blessed Mohammed. Then as from one voice rises the great cry, God is great, stirring emotions that must be felt to be appreciated, and simultaneously all bow and prostrate themselves with their faces to the earth. I have often stood in my window recess going through these motions, unconsciously wrapped in the scene before me, every bright-colored dress or brilliant turban a contribution to an extent of blended color which the eye could not take in, each wave of prostration as it swept over this rainbow-tinted space making aurora-like transformations. In the twilight it was beautiful and impressive beyond most human displays. At this time the Kaaba was opened, but I did not now venture to seek admission, though I did so on a future occasion. At the end of 3 weeks I began to know the ropes and find my way about pretty well. I had taken the bearings of most remarkable objects by the stars and sun, inquiring their names and the histories connected with them. One day, I took a rather wider cruise to the top of a hill, Jebel Kubris, about a quarter of a mile south of the center of the city and 500 or 600 feet high, and rather steep on the north side, from which I hoped to get a good view. On this hill Mohammed is said to have wrestled with a great infidel, one Nimrud, and defeated him by a miracle, Nimrud being much the stronger man. It was on this hill also that Mohammed commanded the moon to rise half in the east and half in the west, then disappear down the sleeve of his mantle. On the highest point will the harem be perched on the day of judgment, previous to ascending into heaven, carrying with it all saved Mohammedans. Here there is a small mosque, from which, as I expected, a bird's-eye view of the whole city can be obtained. The town lies in a basin among steep hills of from 500 to 700 feet in height, and probably not more than 1,200 to 1,500 above the sea. The whole of this valley, about 1.5 miles long by 1/3 of a mile across, is packed and crammed with buildings of all shapes and sizes, placed in no kind of order, climbing far up the steep side of the surrounding hills, with here and there an outlying house on the summit of some rock, looking as though crowded out and waiting for a chance to squeeze into the confusion below, a curious grey mass, flat-topped, to an European eye roofless, half-plastered, for plaster in this climate is always either being put on, or well advanced in coming off, but never to be seen in its entirety. The walls of the houses are composed of uncut stone and rubble from 3 to 6 feet thick, in very high buildings even thicker, but stone is used only for the sills of windows or jambs and arches of doorways, and very little brick is employed anywhere. Notwithstanding the substantial thickness of the walls, tottering ruins may be found by the sides of the most thronged thoroughfares in every part of the city. Many of the houses are of great height, large and factory-like, full of little windows. Seldom two adjacent houses face the same way or are the same height. Nothing resembling a row or street could by any stretch of imagination be extricated from such a chaos of masonry. It was impossible, even from my elevated point of view, to trace 100 yards of open space between houses in any direction. Many of the passages are boarded over, which to a certain extent conceals them, except on the outskirts of the town, where 2 or 3 suburbs straggle off up the less inclined outlets from the valley, and where the ground is not so thickly built over, though with the same systematic irregularity. The rule seems to be that no two things must be alike, an Eastern characteristic developed into a fixed law of non-uniformity in everything about Mecca, a town which, built as it is of fragments of the crumbling rock about, made to adhere with 30% of coarse lime, together with the dusky crowds creeping in swarms about its dark lanes and streets, if such mere tortuous intricacies can be called so, suggests the simile of the giant anthill most strikingly, and indeed it applies better than any other description. There is a great sameness about all this detailed dissimilarity, from the midst of which the harem stands out most prominently, at once fixing the attention, and indeed it is the main feature of Mecca. It is a large quadrangular open space, its longest direction northeast by east and southwest by west, enclosed within 4 arched colonnades or arcades, 190 yards, on the longest sides by 127 yards on the shortest, close up to which, on the exterior, houses are built, except on the east side, where it is bounded by a street skirting the wall of the harem. The arcades, which are 25 feet high, have a row of little domes, 36 on the long and 24 on the short sides, running along the center of the top, which is 50 feet wide, but at the 2 principal entrances, in the middle of the north and west sides, there begins a widening of the roof, which has 2 more rows of domes. These I did not count, and under the arcades the projection of the roof is not apparent, the space being occupied by offices of the harem built under them. There are 6 tall minarets, placed at intervals round the outside of the enclosure, 1 or 2 of which must be considerably over 150 feet in height. From the inside of the arcades a number of stone pathways lead across the gravelled square to a central paved oval space round the Kaaba, a plain unornamented oblong of closely pointed, massive, cyclopean masonry, 38 feet by 30 square, and 40 feet high, as I afterwards ascertained when some portion of the cover was removed. It is covered with a heavy black cloth, which has a good deal of silk in its composition, and all round it, 10 feet from the top, a band about 2.5 feet deep, very richly worked in bullion, with the kalima, the Mohammedan profession of faith, the whole of the black cloth being damasked with the same characters. The marble pavement glistens in the sun from the high state of polish in which it is kept by the feet of the pilgrims, who may be seen at all hours, both night and day, performing the tawaf. There are a few little buildings in the square, such as an erection over the well, Zam-Zam, and the stations of the imams of the different sects. Add to these flocks of blue rock pigeons settled in the square, flying over and about it, perched on every available ledge, not covered with little wire spikes, and I can show you no more of the harem from my present standpoint. There are 3 Turkish forts or castles on the highest points of the hills around, commanding the town, and covering its 3 principal approaches. They form a triangle with one another, northeast, west, and south. Jebel Kubris, like every other resort of pilgrims, is frequented by sturdy beggars, the sturdiest occupying the best positions, having handkerchiefs spread out before them with a few suggestive copper coins laid out on them. Before I left, I was mulcted of, for an Eastern, a fabulous amount of coin by these beggars. A young Arab damsel with lovely eyes, by no means coy, followed me down from the top and beguiled me of my last half piastre when she uncovered the lower part of her face in a dark passage near the bottom of the hill. The measurements and numbers given were obtained at different times by a regular system, which I followed on every opportunity. I carried with me wherever I went a bamboo stick exactly a yard long, which I dropped or laid down carelessly as I moved about. No one would have suspected the zealous devotee crawling on his hands and knees at night round the holy Kaaba was by way of a prayer, mumbling the number of times he moved his stick. The height of buildings I got by measuring their shadows, which bore the same proportion to the object as my stick's shadow bore to 3 feet, provided I had a plain surface, as in the harem. All the measurements given in feet may be relied on as tolerably accurate, and were noted down at the time. On the afternoon of this day, I ventured into the harem alone for the first time. On the day of my arrival in Mecca, the occasion had been one on which I had not been in a condition to observe much, seeing the desperately tiring journey that had just transported me into such a whirl of strange surroundings. But I had now got the run of things, and felt sufficiently at home to go almost anywhere in Mecca. Each of the gates of the harem is kept by a man, generally Hindi, who takes charge of the shoes of the worshippers as they pass in, and deposits each pair separately in a large wicker framework divided into pigeonholes. Should you be in the habit of always using the same gate, you may give this man an occasional present on any special feast or fast day, but, if entering for the first time, or by a gate you are not accustomed to use, he looks for some trifling copper coin, though, as a rule, these men do not openly beg, from which fact I infer they must be paid from the funds of the harem. What is very noticeable on first entering the sacred precincts is the general solemn expression of the faces round you. Everybody has on his Sunday go-to-meeting countenance, and converses in a sober subdued tone, while those sitting have their feet carefully tucked under them. This is a point of etiquette everywhere, but especially to be observed in the harem, and those lying down have their feet turned away from the Kaaba. Should you carry your shoes in your hand, as some do who may be going out by a different gate from the one by which they entered, you must hold them sole to sole, and no one would think of spitting while in the harem, except on the soles of his shoes. Only privileged beggars are to be met with in the harem, such as maimed or very old, and these do not force tribute from you after the manner of bakshish, merely getting in your way, and making themselves and their infirmities conspicuous. One old blind fellow puzzled me for a long time, by the rapidity of his movements from place to place among the thickly-set pillars supporting the arcades without a stick or any other apparent means of guiding himself, until I found by watching him that he was guided by the joints of the pavement over which he walked, feeling their direction and length with his big toes. A number of water carriers go about among the crowd standing liquors up indiscriminately, or getting paid by anyone liberal enough. Sometimes, if you don't give them a trifle after imbibing, their generosity exceeds all bounds, and they douche you from head to foot with a second cupful. As the water is Zam-Zam, you, of course, deem it too great an honor, and bestow a blessing with a benign grin in return for your drenching, beaming outwardly, while the chilly liquid trickles down the small of your back. Here and there may be seen, at any time night or day, parties of devotees sitting in circles droning out short prayers, over and over, hour after hour, with a uniformity of sound and expression, ecstatic grunts and swaying of the body, which to call monotonous would be to speak of the 100-ton gun as a trifle large, or the Great Eastern as a tidy craft indeed. This sort of thing is kept up with a persistent monotony that becomes simply bewildering. Enthusiasts after some hours go into a religious frenzy, and what between sheer exhaustion and their mental condition, work themselves up to foaming inarticulate idiocy. I have seen these fits present the symptoms of epilepsy. To be able to do this well is considered not exactly an accomplishment but rather a gift, and the possessor is looked upon with great reverence. Men's convictions should be respected whatever they may be, but the contemplation of this fanaticism gave rise in me to an unhappy train of thought. To think that the noble faith founded by the Redeemer Mohammed, at whose coming the whole world was lost in the darkness of sin, if it ever was, and to the stimulating influence of whose hostility Christianity may be said to owe its present state, if I read my history aright. To think that the faith preached by such as the earnest Omar, the faith held by the illustrious Moors and many a chivalrous Saladin, should have fallen off in the hands of these Eastern weaklings to a mere belief in prayer-doing. How much cant do we hear iterated and reiterated about the essential unprogressiveness of Mohammedanism? I fear, as that stirring faith has failed to make anything of the Eastern, there is but a poor lookout for Christianity. If every tinted skin from light straw to ebony were evangelical low church tomorrow, there would be as much opium and tobacco consumed as before. The only benefit to humanity would be found in the workings of the Protestant alcohol and six-shooter, those sturdy irregular followers of the Christian church militant, whose cutting up of the retreat none but the very fittest of the fit survive. Keep off the grass. I do not charge my readers with habitually infringing park bylaws, when I suppose that at some time they may have found it convenient to cut across the tender turf in spite of the above admonition. Well, while promenading the arcades of the harem for the first time, I felt a precisely similar sensation of uncomfortableness as I have felt while committing the above offense. No more and yet I remember only a very few years ago being oppressed for days by the horrible guilt of having attended divine service in a dissenting chapel. How a few years of roughing it does knock hereditary prejudice out of a man, to be sure. It is now enough for me that I have met many good men, good men and true, of most religions, Catholic, Moslem, Protestant, or Buddhist, more good than bad, so the world may still be lived in, thank goodness. How I could ramble on. But I must not do so here, though I may remind the reader that I have only promised to spin my yarn in my own way, and ask him to bear with my occasional wanderings. So just another word before standing off on the long tack, and if you are the reader I suppose myself writing for, I shall not offend by offering the following little bit of instruction. The name Mohammedanism is applied by Christians to a faith, the followers of which do not know it by any such name. They call themselves as worshippers of the one God, and have, in my humble opinion, a rather fine conception of that deity. They are true believers in all the patriarchs and prophets from Adam down, through Abraham, Moses, Jesus Christ to Mohammed, whose coming they believe to have been prophesied by the man of peace, whose reappearance on earth is prophesied by Mohammed. And it is generally held by so-called Mohammedan theologians that the time of his reappearance is very near at hand, so much so that the mere repetition of such a statement was a standing byword among the pilgrims of every nation while I was in Mecca. Also the old idea of the near approach of the end of the world is very prevalent in the East just now, which, all in all, is about as ripe for the reception of some Darwish Peter the Hermit as it well could be, and were he to come upon the scene in some such a centre as Hyderabad in the Deccan, Mohammedanism might be giving some very troublesome death throes in a year or two. However, we need not be very much alarmed, as they have not sufficient unity left among them to organize anything like a formidable jihad, crescent aid, anywhere. To return to Mecca. Observing and inquiring were now the only things which recalled me to my identity. I had become so accustomed to my surroundings, and accommodated myself to circumstances so rapidly, that in 6 weeks I was as much at home as if I had been a Mohammedan all my life. I formed friends, had little tiffs and jealousies with my companions in the household, we all having the same interests, and even eating out of the same plates, without offering to bite, though the disposition to do so is so strong as to be barely under control. Darwinites may safely take my word for this fact, and are at liberty to make use of it as a startling analogy. My trenchermates were a blind Molvi, and a gentleman with only 2 fingers on his right hand, the only one with which a Mohammedan may take food. I had, with infinite pains, worked this myself, thinking I would stand a better chance, but the first time I sat down I found I had immensely underrated my friend's abilities, for I never saw 2 men with such an alarming capacity for curry and rice, or who showed such extraordinary skill at putting it away. At first I was a little fastidious, and had rather a prejudice in favor of not seeing a greasy black hand scratching merrily among my food. I did not seem to enjoy it as much as I ought, however, it was only a prejudice which I had to overcome. I began by imagining lines drawn over the dish, separating a corner of it to myself and operating inside these bounds. This sort of thing did not last long. The two-fingered gentleman's two long fingers would come ambling along through my little rice wall before I had got my third fistful swallowed, or the Mulvey's skinny hand would wave like a mesmeric pass over the dish, scatter grains that had stuck to his fingers from the last mouthful over it, and then alight on my most meaty morsel, a piece I had perhaps had my eye on from the first, but it would have shown greedy haste on my part to have taken it so early in the play. No, I hadn't a chance with these two thieves, for they got away 5/6 of the mess every meal, and with such grace too. Bless you, they would say, how little you eat, Mohammed Amin, as they shared the last mouthful between them. There was a time when I thought, to pretend to know anything about India, you must at least own to a passion for curry and rice. Yes, that was before I set myself up for an authority on the matter, when I could not have given you the following recipe for a real native curry. Set a pot on the fire, put anything and some water into it, add saffron and powdered chilies till you are perfectly satisfied that the keenest palate could detect nothing else, and it is so hot that you would rather be skinned alive than eat a spoonful of it. Call it by the name of the next chief ingredient. Cook it in any way, as long as you like, and in the meantime cast about for something else to put in it. It does not in the least matter what, a handful of shot or a piece of brown paper, just throw anything at it, you're perfectly safe. Serve it at any meal, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, all are equally suitable, and, if a victim hints that it is rather hot, and you want to be thoroughly native, swear by Allah, it has not heard the name of chili. After the evening meal, we all used to sit round a lamp in the middle of the room, eating sweets, smoking hookahs, and telling stories. I got to be very fond of the hookah. The smoke passes through a chamber full of water which takes up the more solid particles and condenses the steam from the tobacco and cools the smoke, which is always inhaled right into the lungs and has a very soothing effect, though somewhat painful to a beginner. Sometimes I would tell a story, something in this style. The Amir begins by asking me, "You have been in many countries, Mohammed Amin." "Why not, Your Honor? Is not my work sailing? I have heard there is a big fish in the sea, bigger than a ship. I have seen many and hunted them in the sea to the south of India," and so go on to give a long account of whaling to which all would listen most attentively. The Mfor are occasionally asking shrewd questions, or I would tell of a country where the sun does not set for 6 months, where there is hardly any land to be seen, all ice, ice, ice. The Amir has said, "Good. Is there such a place in the world?" "Yes." "Good. If there is nothing but ice, for what do ships go?" This is expected to be a poser, and the whole circle say yes, yes, and look inquiringly at me. "Oh, there is a big animal called walrus, as big as 2 camels, having the body of an ox, the feet of a crocodile, the head of a tiger, tusks like an elephant, and tail of a fish. It is very fat, and we went to hunt them." I can see incredulity on every countenance, and the Amir puts a final clencher with "Good. And what can it get to eat to make it so fat?" "The fish in the sea." Here follow general laughter and exclamations of "God, what a father of lies." I invented many wonderful stories to amuse them and found, here as everywhere, truth less credited than fiction. I have been simply disbelieved when I said I had seen the late Sultan Abdul Aziz and Her Majesty. Even an attempt to describe their appearance would not carry conviction. Altogether I was not at all unhappy, and remember many pleasant evenings with my Mohammedan friends, with whom I was, I believe, a bit of a favourite all round, and looked upon as an agreeable harmless fellow, my punctilious observance of all religious duties making me much approved by the most devout. I often astonished even the blind Molvi by my knowledge of divinity and the soundness of my principle, though I could neither read nor write much, and had spent my whole life among men who were only Mohammedan by name. I made also a number of acquaintances outside, a chatty old barber to whom I went twice a week to get my head shaved, and who had been a company sepoy, I found very entertaining. He knew Bombay well, and liked comparing notes with me, talking about those shaitan English, whom I could not help thinking he remembered kindly, though he of course joined me in my Mohammedan disapproval of them, expressing a little proper patriotic antipathy. One day, when work and talk were rather slack, the old fellow casually remarked, apropos of the previous conversation, "There is an Englishwoman in Mecca, the Lady Venus by name." This was an eye-opener, though I took care not to show it, merely replying in an uninterested way, "Praise be to God, how long has she been here?" "Many years." "Whose zanana is she in?" "Nobody's. She works at sewing and keeps herself, a Nawab gives her a room in his zenana house, and she does some little work for him. She is old. She is not an English lady. I think perhaps she is a half-caste. No, she is a real lady, Sahib. Would you like to see her? Yes, I will speak English to her and find out who she is. For I did not conceal any of my Christian accomplishments, instead, I rather bragged of them and got it believed I pretended to know more than I really did. Whether the old barber wanted to test me with a real Englishwoman, or whether he did it in a kindly busybody spirit, I cannot say. There is no accounting for motives. At any rate, he arranged a meeting at his brother-in-law's house, a Maulvi, at 2 o'clock next day, saying he was certain to get the woman to come. The old fellow may have seen clean through me and expected a tip from one of us, and, if so, he got one. You may be sure I had but one thing to think about that night. An English woman in Mecca, been here many years, impossible. I have seen a gentleman driving an ox team in his swallow-tails, and once met a Cambridge BA before the mast in a whaler, but this seemed impossible even to me. Still, I thought, I am here, and I did not find it very difficult to get here either, and great misgivings came as it occurred to me. I don't know how in the name of the Prophet I could get out if anyone wanted to stop me, and then, to have to spend a whole life as she was doing, in such wretchedness and misery, buried alive in Mecca. I could put up with it while the novelty and the excitement of acting a difficult part lasted, but 12 months of it would kill me. No, I said, she can't be an Englishwoman, and I consoled myself by settling she must be a country-born half-caste, fair enough to be called English. However, I should see. The next day I put on a clean tunic and bright red cummerbund, and paid as much attention to the set and folds of my turban as I ever did to the tying of a white choker, and brushed out my beard with a, Allah preserve us, pig's bristle brush. That brush had got me into great disrepute for a time, for incautiously telling the Amir what it was made of when asked, but no notice was taken of it, as they did not want to believe, and I took care to publicly explain on the first opportunity how hair brushes were made of elephant's hair, and the old bristles went their round of some 24 faithful beards every day. Allah preserve us! Allah forgive us! When, having got myself up for the occasion, I hurried off at the right time in a great state of anticipation to the good Maulvi's house, called a boy in the yard, announced myself, and went upstairs into a little room about the size of a small bedroom, very clean, the only sign of untidiness being the usual dust heap in the doorway. At one end of this room were a number of shelves let into the wall, covered with curious chinaware. This is to be seen in nearly every well-to-do house in Mecca, though how or at what time the chinaware found its way into the Hijaz in such quantities I could not find out. Perhaps it comes directly through Persia, but I heard of no existing import trade. It is likely to be very old, as it is valued only for ornamental purposes. Some of the vases were filled with artificial flowers, and 2 French flower lithographs hung on the wall. Representations of animal life are prohibited to Mohammedans. There was also a 6 feet by 4 feet window, with open teakwood shutters, roughly carved in an elaborate pattern of very unfinished, but substantial joinery. The only furniture in the room was a cushioned ottoman running half round the walls about 18 inches high and 3 feet wide, having 1 or 2 pillows lying on it, a rough teakwood cabinet standing against the wall, and, lying on it, the Maulvi's Quran, praying carpet, and turban. On the floor a good Persian carpet, 1 or 2 small mats, and of course a hookah and spittoon. This may be taken as a good specimen of a room in any middle-class Meccan's house. The occupants were the Maulvi, a kind honest old man with a genial pleasant face. Who could believe he had been a great conspirator in his youth? Yet he is now an exile, and dare not return to his own country, and is said to have been one of the most daring mutineer leaders at Lucknow. I was greatly taken with the genuineness of the old fellow. He may have fought, and fought hard, for his faith and his country, but I believe he never acted other than conscientiously according to his lights, which is saying a good deal for a Hindi. Seated on the ottoman near him, the barber, a most ordinary cuss, a shiny old black with a straight white beard and a tongue like a Bengali, and the woman sitting on the floor in the costume of the country, a figure squatted down with a sheet thrown over it and the edges well tucked under, 2 slits somewhere near the eyes with pieces of gauze sewn over them for looking through. Give the whole a convulsive subdued shaking, and you have the Lady Venus, as I first saw her. I slipped off my shoes, entered the room, and made my bow and peace be upon you, exchanged a few take-a-seats, Don T stirs, with the Molvi, then subsided cross-legged on the floor opposite the woman. She evidently understood my real character, and it seemed a painful interview to her. We sat silently for some minutes, the motion of her hand to her eyes under the veil showing she was in tears. At length the Molvi spoke to her in Arabic, telling her to ask me some questions in English, as my name, age, country, employment, all of which I answered as I wished the Molvi to believe, but when she asked, at his instance, how I came to Mecca, and I replied, God put it into my head, which she interpreted, God put it into his heart, I felt safe and talked more freely. After a time, by her advice, we talked in Hindi on general and safe topics of interest to both. I found that she had been amongst Mohammedans since 1858, and satisfied myself, in the half-hour's conversation, that she was a real, educated Englishwoman. When she rose to go I asked her in English if I might shake hands with her. She said, no, and told me the part of the harem in which she prayed, where I could meet her any day at noon. Afterwards I stayed to dinner with the Molvi, his poor relation, the barber, joining us. He improved the occasion after dinner, over a pipe, by giving me a long religious and moral discourse, a facsimile of the sort of advice we get from our good old God-fearing seniors at home. He made me feel miserably hypercritical and as ashamed of myself as I could be. I believe I blushed when the old fellow said, "Go, and peace be upon you, trust in prayer, and be sure God will protect you," at the same time slipping $1 into my hand as a token of good feeling. This is an Eastern custom of simple substantial politeness, very preferable to "what will you have to drink?" Though much the same kind of thing. When I got home I found the Emir had suddenly made up his mind to start on a long-talked-of pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 2 days, and that 4 of the party and myself were to be left to occupy the house till his return. During the next 2 days it was all hands and idlers hard at work at it, getting ready for the road, purchasing stores, and packing boxes. The Amir personally undertook that most important part of the preparations, the confectionery, and had the 3rd warrior, the head cook, and myself as assistants. We made about half a hundredweight of a new kind of sweetmeat the Amir had just taken a fancy to, intended to last the trip, but the Amir ate so much of it before it was cooked that he made himself sick, so he took an emetic, had a good cry, and would not have any of it packed up. This was of a piece with the whole thing, everybody ordering, nobody obeying, packing up things in the wrong boxes, leaving the most important articles to the last moment. I never expected they would get away at all, and certainly they would not if they had waited till things were in order. However, camels had been engaged and came at the right time, nothing ready of course, still away they went, bundled everything handy onto the camels and started, found they had forgotten something, sent back for it, sent back for something else, and kept on sending back for things till they got too far away. One of the last things sent back for was the Emir's watch, a very valuable English gold one, which was found under the rug where he had been enjoying an opium sleep during the hubbub of the last 2 hours before starting. All my Hindi friends were addicted to opium, and in any emergency used just to increase the dose a little and trust to Providence. They got on all right in a kind of good enough fashion, by the help of God, they say, and I suppose that's it. I know they left half the things purchased for the voyage, and took a couple of camel-loads of rubbish that wouldn't be of any earthly use to them. Before they left the Amir's public purse-bearer gave me $30 for the support of my companions and myself while he was away. The 4 who were left with me were the 3rd warrior, a boy, the sort of youth you instinctively call Jack the moment you see him, and a couple of old black nonentities, one to cook and the other to eat. The boy Jack's story was rather a characteristic one as to how he came to be with the M4R. He was 13 years of age, the son of a Hindi small farmer, and had been seized with the desire to rove, which I suppose we are all subject to more or less strongly. It seems to make its appearance at some time in most people's lives, and just as the English youth looks to the sea as a safety valve through which to exhaust his uncontrollable wandering propensities, so the Mohammedan invariably vents the same mania in a pilgrimage to Mecca. Jack felt a call, and appears to have had it badly too, for though his father beat him and his friends laughed at him, still he held out for months keeping up the same cry, always having the same object in view, he must go to Mecca. He offered to accompany pilgrims and work, but of course could not get the employment so much coveted. Such pilgrims as do take servants confer a great favor on them by doing so, indeed most wealthy pilgrims take their relatives in such capacities. Remuneration is seldom expected by any, more than is sufficient for their subsistence. At last the mania reached to such a pitch with Jack that one night he stole all the money his father had, 1 rupee, and ran off. He first walked from his home near Hyderabad Sindh to Kotiye, and here his story became rather confused. He seemed to have gone on fire ships, steamers, and fire carriages, railway trains. For the first time in his life, he is only clear that he found himself in Karachi after some days, and knew he was a good step on his road to Mecca. Jack then stowed away on board an English steamer for Bombay. How a country boy who had never seen a ship before could be up to this I cannot understand, and was put in prison in Bombay for doing so. When he got out he told his story to many Mohammedans whom he asked for help, and who thought it very great kismat, and that he must be a chosen of God, but though he received enough charity nobody offered to take or send him to Mecca. Jack's zeal had not spent itself yet, no, his success hitherto encouraged him to go on. The pilgrim season came round, crowded steamers were leaving Bombay for Jeddah, and on board one of these Jack managed to conceal himself on the day of sailing. When the ship was about 4 days out, all the pilgrims were mustered, and Jack, with half a dozen others, was found to have no ticket. It is probable nothing would have been done to them really, more than a kick or two, but the officers of the ship made a great fuss, sent them up onto the lookout bridge, and half frightened them to death. 2 of the stowaways were the only 2 barbers on board, so the other 500 pilgrims got up a subscription to pay for them, but the officers would not let these 2 go without the rest, so they all spent another day on the bridge. In the meantime the Amir, who was a first-class passenger, heard of this, and also heard that one of the delinquents was from Hyderabad, and thinking he was a countryman of his own, at once made up the subscription and had them all released. He then sent for Jack, but, finding he came from Sindh and not from the Deccan, was of course very much disgusted. Nevertheless, he heard the boy's story, and ended by taking him into his service. The boy is now with us in Mecca, happy as Larry. Not only is the stolen rupee intact, but he has added 7 annas to his treasure, and has a very good outfit for a nigger. I never could get on with this boy, always had to be giving him mild Hindi slaps, and abusing his female relatives. He was a cheeky young dog. I could not help a certain amount of sympathy, a sort of fellow feeling, and that perhaps led me to give him too much of his own way. The zenana was also left, but they lived in another part of the house, and I saw little of them. An old hag, one of those Eastern horrors more hideous than European could picture, a fury with a face like 3 kicks in a mud wall, used to come down to us to beg tea or anything nice we might happen to have going for her mistress the Begum, the Amir's mother, who was the head of the zenana, for though we lived in completely separate households, our culinary operations were within the range of the old lady's, the Begum's, nose, and she never failed to make her ancient handmaiden swoop down upon any little extra indulgence we might choose to be having. The old women servitors, having discarded the veil, take the place in India of the eunuch in other Mohammedan countries, that is, go-betweens between the men's and women's apartments, acting as spies on both, and are generally chosen for remarkable ugliness. The first thing we did in the morning after the Amir's departure was to organize a general clean-up. The sleeping apartment had not been swept out since we had been living in it, and was filthy. We removed out of this room, 15 feet by 12 feet, and threw into the street outside, this being the custom of the country, 8 large packing cases full of rags, spoilt and wasted, fragments of food in different stages of rot, broken pots, bottles, tins, old shoes, straw, torn matting, and sticks. Besides all this, 2 snakes, a dead cat, a great many rats and mice, both dead and alive, and about 5 or 6 pounds weight of maggots out of one corner. I was afraid to raise the carpet. Heaven knows what awful disclosures might have followed. All this brought a perfect treasure trove to Jack in the way of lost trifles, and I found among the rubbish a ball of opium, which I pocketed. Next, we cleared out the cooking room adjoining the sleeping room. In the middle of this room there was a large sink, a concave circular stone about 4 feet in diameter, with a round hole in the center, down which the refuse and offal of cooking and butchering were thrown. Bound this stone we used to sit and perform our everlasting ablutions. The aroma emitted from the hole was poo. Odors of Eden, myrrh, aloes, and cassia. Poo. Its fragrance varied in kind from day to day, but always seemed to be at its worst. What horrible depths of corruption existed below might be guessed from the thick layer of maggots that formed a coating to the inside of the hole as far down as could be seen, constantly writhing and crawling upwards, spreading round at the surface, and developing into flies which filled the air with their black buzzing filthinesses. I formed a plan for the amending of this which was strongly opposed at first. However, I got the third warrior and Jack to join me, and we carried the day. We filled the large rice pan with water, about 6 gallons, made it hot, and emptied it boiling down the hole. This we did 3 times, with such beneficial effect that no objection was raised to it on the next occasion when the maggots began to appear, and we very soon saw a sensible diminution in the swarms of flies. I then purchased some benzoin, a yellow gum or resin, which has a very agreeable scent when burnt and is the aversion of all kinds of winged vermin. With this we fumigated the whole place, and so completed the sanitary arrangements of our little household. I am aware the foregoing savoury fragment is not very inviting, but I think the reader will recognize how scanty justice would have been done to the description had such important factors in the sum of our discomfort been omitted. During the last 3 days I had had no time to look for the Lady Venus, but the moment I was at liberty I set out in quest of her. To such of my readers as may be wholly unacquainted with the customs of the East, I may here explain why in my interview with the Lady Venus such great caution was preserved. Our being English, and the subjects of our conversations, which will appear obvious and sufficient reasons, had really little to do with it. If we had been born Meccans, we should not have been able to maintain nearly such free intercourse as we did, for we should have had more prying friends to make scandal of our, from a Mohammedan point of view, grossly improper goings-on. Immoral they would have been called, in a society where it is a canon that no woman may uncover her face to any man who is not her father, brother, or husband, and it was chiefly on this account that our meetings had to be of such a clandestine character. Anyone familiar with the social habits of Mohammedans, the jealousy, conventional and affected, of the men, and the formal restraint under which the women are held, will be surprised that I was able to walk in public with the lady without attracting notice in the way I did, but in Mecca the women are allowed great freedom. Many of the most ordinary precautions of the harem are relaxed, and it is quite the correct thing for the women of the wealthy to appear at public worship unattended, praying among the men, no part of the harem being set apart for them as in every other mosque. On the second day after the Emir's departure, I went to that part of the harem she had mentioned as her place of prayer at noonday. After the prayers I remained sitting, counting my beads. There are 99 beads in a Mohammedan rosary, not counting certain little pendants or stops. As you count your beads, for each names or attributes of God, the 100 is not complete, as the perfection of God is unlimited. A Mohammedan therefore says, God is great, good, merciful, etc., 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 through the 99, imagine the rest, a sort of 99 to 9 recurring idea, or, as others say, the 100th attribute is love, which man shares with God, and so is not mentioned. When the crowd had dispersed I observed a little way off on my left a woman sitting alone. I thought this might be my friend, and looked fixedly at her for a few minutes. She was evidently looking at me, and I thought I noticed a beckoning movement of the hands under her garments, so I rose and walked towards her. She then got up and went out of the harem, and I followed her at a little distance. We had gone some quarter of a mile through the town in this way, she always looking back at me before turning a corner, when she stopped, and let me come up to her. She at once addressed me in English, telling me to walk by her side, and that we were going to a Hindi friend's where we could talk undisturbedly as long as we liked. Some 200 yards farther on we passed through a narrow part of the street, where a Turkish sentry was posted. Here she talked loudly in Arabic, and I answered her in the same, making a great display of such expressions as I was master of. Half an hour's walk brought us to a little shilin, into which we went and sat down. I found the old Hindi who dwelt in it very well disposed. He made tea, gave me a smoke of his hookah, excused himself, and left us to ourselves. What a talk we had! How we let loose our English tongues! Sometimes we laughed wildly, sometimes she cried. It must have been a strange pleasure to her to hear and talk her native language after so many years. I, who had only been a few weeks away from my kind, felt most foolishly elated, talked all kinds of nonsense, anything that came into my head, just for chattering's sake. We asked one another questions, and asked others without waiting for answers. We had 3 hours of this, and then the old Hindi came in, and we thought it time to be going. Before parting, she raised her veil and showed me her face, which was as English as my own. We also shook hands, and arranged that a boy Abdullah, a mutual acquaintance, should be our future means of communication. We then parted, and went home by different roads. That night, as I lay on my rug, thinking over the occurrences of the day, and hugging myself in the anticipation of many such pleasant conversations, for there was a taste of danger and secrecy that added zest and a feeling of having given another pleasure that made me supremely satisfied and contented that night, only one thing troubled me. Almost her last words to me had been, "I can't make out who you are, child." She always called me child, I suppose on account of my light-hearted attempts to raise her spirits, and I could not make out who she was. So there and then I thought over a list of questions I meant to ask her at our next meeting, but man proposes, etc. Little did I think it would be some weeks before we should meet again, and that then we should have much more interesting matter in hand, and, most incongruous incongruity, a pilgrim fell asleep in sight of the Kaaba repeating those lines of Hood's, "The other sex, the tender, the fair, what wide reverses of fate are there!"